Hello, in this video I want to talk a little bit about government policies and in particular trade policies versus domestic policies. But before I do that, I just want to remind you of what you already know about domestic policies in a closed market, the things you learned in Principles of Economics as well as other courses. So one thing that you often study is, of course, a tax, a specific tax, a production tax. So what happens then, if you recall, is that when you have a production tax, the marginal cost increases by the amount of the tax. So our new supply curve would shift up by the tax. So it will look something like this. And as long as demand and supply are not perfectly inelastic, we will see that at the new quantity, the price that consumers pay, which would be right here, PC, would be higher than it was in the original equilibrium, but it's not going to increase by the full amount of the tax because the producers will share the tax incidence. So, consumers pay a higher price, producers receive a lower price, but in particular, the price that consumers pay and producers receive are no longer equal to each other due to the tax. All right, so this is something we're going to be thinking about shortly. What happens to prices that consumers pay and producers receive when you have different kinds of policies in an open economy? But before we do that, let's look at the production subsidy as well. A production subsidy will shift the marginal cost of the firm down, and therefore our supply curve will shift out like this. So it'll be S plus the subsidy right there. And we will now see that we'll have a new equilibrium right there. At that new equilibrium, the price that consumers pay, PC again, is going to be less than what they used to pay, but it's not going to decrease by the full amount of the subsidy because producers will receive a higher price than they used to receive. All right, so we have here again that the price paid by consumers is not equal to the price paid by producers. One thing that we might want to do in both of these scenarios here is to talk about the welfare effects of these things. So let me just quickly talk about that. I'm going to just shade it in here. So what we saw in the production tax in the upper diagram was that the consumer surplus will be decreasing. It used to be this big triangle, and after a tax is only the shaded area. And producer surplus will also change. It used to be this big triangle, and after the tax, producers will only receive this much. So that looks like the tax is very bad, and it is bad. But there is one redeeming feature, which is that the government is able to collect revenue, and therefore we have to add that into our welfare analysis. And when we do that, we see that there is in fact still a triangle here that is a loss in welfare surplus that nobody gets, and that's what we call the deadweight loss. When we look at the production subsidy, we would have something very similar. Here we see that consumer surplus increased from this area to include this area as well. Producer surplus also increased. They used to be this triangle, and now they get this much more. In fact, when you're looking at this one, everything looks really good in terms of subsidies, and this is a common mistake that people who are not economists make, which is that you have a subsidy, consumers pay a lower price, that sounds good. Producers receive a higher price, that also sounds good. Consumer surplus increases, producer surplus increases, everything sounds really good until we realize that there is an associated cost with these benefits, which is that the government will have to spend money taxpayer money, and the government expenditure will be equal to this entire rectangle, giving us a loss in surplus equal to our deadweight loss, which again I'm shading in here with a yellow. All right, so what we have here is any kind of domestic policy in a closed market will be welfare reducing, and the price that consumers pay will be different from the price that producers receive, whether you have a production tax or a production subsidy. All right, so that kind of sets the tone. Let's then go to a situation that we are more interested in, namely an open economy where we have international trade. All right, so next I want to look at a trade policy. In order to keep this video, not too long, I'm just going to use an importing nation as my illustrative example, and we're going to be thinking about an import tariff. So what I have drawn here is the basic demand and supply diagram when you have an importing country. So we have our domestic demand curve, our domestic supply curve. Obviously, for this country, if we were to draw in the autarky relative price, the price would have been way up here. Maybe I'll just write that in, PM, let's call it autarky. But because the world price is much lower, so we have this PMW down here, we can see that the quantity that consumers want to consume at that lower price, so QMD, is much, much greater than the domestic producers would like to supply. And therefore we have imports equal to, let's just call that big M here, imports equal to the quantity of M demanded minus the quantity of M supplied. All right, so that's good. And we have done this one, and you know that the country is better off with trade than without trade. But now we're going to do the case of an import tariff to see what happens in this economy. So what happens is that we are assuming that this country is small. All right, a small country assumption is basically the same as saying that we have many buyers and many suppliers when we have a perfectly competitive market from the closed economy. And when the country is very small relative to the rest of the world, any policy adopted by this small country will not change the world price. All right, so again, this is similar to the standard assumption in perfectly competitive markets. The behavior of one consumer will not affect the market price. And here the consumer is a country, and the market is the entire world. So therefore, when we have a trade policy like an import tariff, the only thing that's going to change is the price within the country. So the domestic price changes, but the world price stays the same. All right, so the way we draw that in a diagram is to, I would draw the new terms of trade line here plus the tariff. Let's call the tariff T here now. So here we have that this is the PMW plus the tariff. The price, the world price, have increased by the full amount of the tariff. All right, another mistake that people make is to think that the price that domestic producers sell the good for will be different from the price that foreign producers sell the good for. That is not true. The price will be the same no matter where the product is produced. And the reason is that once you put a tariff on imports, obviously imports will look a lot more expensive, and therefore consumers are going to switch over to buying domestically produced goods. However, you notice here that at that price, consumers want to consume a lot more than the domestic firms can possibly supply, and therefore we're going to have a massive shortage in this domestic market. And whenever you have a shortage, prices start increasing. So the prices will just slowly increase along the domestic supply curve here until the price of domestically produced goods is equal to the price of foreign produced goods. So the world price plus the tariff is going to be the price of all goods consumed by consumer, no matter where they are produced. And of course, when the price increases, as we see here, you can see that consumers change their behavior. They will want to consume a smaller quantity of goods. And the domestic producers also change their behavior. They want to produce more now that they can receive a higher price for their goods. And okay, so that's all good and well. So there's a couple of points I want to do here before we do a welfare analysis. First of all, we have to notice that here, the world price, right, the world price did not change. But the domestic price paid by consumers and the domestic price received by producers did change. And therefore, we have that the price consumers pay is equal to the price domestic producers receive, but both of those prices are different from the world price. All right, so this is very different from what we're used to in a closed economy, where a tax created a wedge between the domestic price paid by consumers and the price received by producers. Here, domestic consumers and domestic producers receive or pay the same price, but they are both different from the world price. Anyway, so like I said before, these changes will have welfare effects, and therefore we can conduct welfare analysis. So the way I would do that is to put some letters in here. We can do it in two ways. We could put, let me just do this right now. We could put letters in all of these areas to see what happens to, surplus before and after the import tariff. Or we could just put the letters in the areas that are actually relevant to the change in surplus. I wrote all the letters here, but I'm actually going to do the change. So what happens here with an import tariff, obviously we have noticed that consumers pay a higher price and they consume a lower quantity. Clearly they're going to be worse up. So the loss in consumer surplus is going to be these areas D, E, F, and G. Producers, they should be happy because the price is higher and they able to sell more goods. So the domestic producer will see an increase in producer surplus equal to D. All right, but we're not quite done because a secondary effects of the import tariff, or maybe it's a direct effect of it, is that the government will be able to collect revenue. They collect the tariff revenue, and that's equal to F. All right? If we put all this together, we can see what the impact is going to be on the entire country by looking at the total surplus. And we see here that, the D's cancel, the F cancel, and what we're left with here is minus E, G. All right, these areas actually have names. E, that's called the production distortion cost. PDC, production distortion cost. All right, that's the cost of distorting the supply market here. Basically what we're saying is that domestic producers are producing too much. There are producers that are more efficient, that can produce this good at a cheaper price, but we are asking our more expensive, our higher cost producers to do it instead. And that is the cost in terms of resources misallocated. G is the consumption distortion cost, and this is the notion that consumers have to pay more than they really should be paying for this good based on our production circumstances. So put them both together, and this is what we usually would call the deadweight loss of the import tariff. Clearly here we would say that import tariffs are not good if we care about the entire country. So, of course, we also notice that it is good for producers. So if your goal is to favor a particular group because they are, I don't know, maybe they lobbied you or there's some connection. If you want to favor the producers in this import competing industry, then an import tariff would be good. But we have to remember that the cost is significant. Consumers are worse off, and of course there is a deadweight loss. So there's a cost in terms of favoring our domestic producers equal to the deadweight loss and consumers being worse off. All right, so that's the trade policy. Now I'm going to just look at a domestic policy that will be similar to this one. Okay, so I want to talk about a domestic policy here. There are many different kinds. We can talk about a production tax, production subsidy, consumption tax, consumption subsidy, but I just want to use production subsidy as my illustrative example in this video. So what we have here then is the government is going to give a production subsidy to its domestic firms. Clearly, a domestic producer receiving a subsidy will want to increase its production. They want to produce more output. Quantity supply will increase. Now, usually when we have an increase in supply, there will be a surplus and prices will tend to decrease. However, here, there is no need for the domestic firm to lower its price because consumers are currently importing the good at the world price. So the domestic producers can sell as much as they want at the world price. That is, this increase in domestic output just replaces imports. All right, so there is no true surplus that makes the price fall. So instead, the price stays the same. Consumers will pay the same price as before. All right, so having said that, let me draw this diagram first. So when I draw in, so we know with a production subsidy, the supply curve is going to shift out. So I'm going to draw that. So let's just call that S plus the subsidy here, S plus S. And we can see that the subsidy will increase the quantity supplied by the producers from QMS to QMS1. So there's an increase in quantity supplied, but because the price stays the same, the quantity demanded at that price will stay the same. So the only impact is that the number of imports will decrease. There is a decrease in imports. Now, again, whenever we think about these different types of policies, trade policies versus domestic policies, the key thing is to figure out what happens to the price. So what we have here in this example is that the price that consumers pay will be equal to the terms of trade, right? But the price that producers receive, right, they sell it for the terms of trade, P, but then they get a subsidy from the government, so the price that producers receive will be greater than both, will be greater than both the price that consumers pay, which is equal to the terms of trade. All right, so what happened here then, when we think about the welfare effects, is that since the price consumers pay stays the same, and the quantity that they consume stays the same, there will be no impact on consumer surplus, that the welfare of consumers will stay exactly the same. However, producers will get a higher price and they will produce a higher quantity, so therefore we will expect producer surplus to increase. However, it will not come free, because whenever you have a production subsidy, the government's going to have to pay out subsidies. That is, they're going to have to use taxpayer money to give to shift money from taxpayers to the domestic producers. And now I'm going to show how that looks on our diagram. So first of all, the price, so let me just put a few things here. So here's the world price, and that's equal to the price that consumers receive. But the price that consumers pay, the price that producers receive is actually equal to the world price plus the subsidy. So they get this much up here. And if I were to put a couple letters in the areas that are created, we see that there is a possible welfare effect. So first of all, let's just go through those. Consumer surplus, well, again, the price consumers pay and the quantity consumers consume is unchanged, and therefore the consumer surplus is unchanged. Producer surplus receive a higher price and they sell more units of goods. That gives them an increase in surplus, which is equal to A. Government revenue, again, nothing is free here. So the government revenue is equal to A and B. That is, they have to give a subsidy for every unit produced by the domestic firms. The subsidy is this height of the rectangle, and the number of goods is the base here, and therefore the area of the rectangle is government's revenue, which is negative because they're paying it out. And therefore we see that the impact on the entire country is minus B. So here, because there is no impact on the consumer, we only have a production distortion cost. There is no consumption distortion cost. So here the production distortion cost is equal to the deadweight loss. This is actually a very important point, and I'm gonna make that point again in the next slide. But here, what we see here is that if a government has a policy to promote its domestic producers, we have now seen two ways of doing so. One, you can give an import tariff. The import tariffs makes the domestic producers better off. But it came at a deadweight loss that included both a production distortion cost and a consumption distortion cost. Now, if you really care about domestic producers, if you simply give them money to produce more, that is, you do a production subsidy, then you benefit, the domestic producers benefit, but the cost to the country in terms of deadweight loss is lower because there is only a production distortion cost and you can avoid paying the consumption distortion cost. This is why, all things equal, if you have a goal of benefiting one group, a trade policy will always distort more things in the economy than a domestic policy does. Maybe you remember the Pigouvian tax, or you have this principle from environmental policy which says if there is a market failure, you should always address the market failure at its closest point. Well, that applies here as well. If you have a goal, you always want to address the goal at its closest point. If you do a trade policy, you will always mess with more than one group of people, and therefore the deadweight loss is going to be higher. All right, let me try to think or to show that again in the next slide. All right, so in this slide, I just want to talk about the very, very close connection between trade policy and domestic policy. And the bottom line is going to be this. Any trade policy can be perfectly replicated by adopting two separate domestic policies. And in this example, when we're looking at an importing country and an import tariff, it turns out that an import tariff can be replicated by adopting a production subsidy, because a production subsidy will increase domestic production, and a consumption tax, which of course will reduce domestic consumption. And both of those effects are exactly what happens with an import tariff. So I'm going to draw those effects in my diagram here, and I'm going to try to show what I just told you. So first of all, if I were to do an import tariff for a small country, what we would have is that the domestic price would increase by the full amount of the tariff. So we'll have the terms of trade increase. So the world price will go from PMW to this higher price plus the tariff. And of course, what we have seen here from before is that quantity supply is going to increase and quantity consumed, quantity demanded will decrease. So the question now is, given these two effects from a tariff, can we replicate that with or two actually domestic policies? Well, yes. First of all, if we adopted a production subsidy, we can shift the supply curve out, and if we do it just right, we can get the supply curve to increase quantity or the domestic production by exactly the same amount as the import tariff increased it. All right, so we can go from QNP to QMP prime, if you will. So we can replicate that. So that increase is exactly the same. And if we do a consumption tax, we can shift the demand curve in such a way that we can reduce the quantity consumed at home in domestic market by exactly the same amount as the import tariff reduced the quantity consumed. All right, so this one here, let me just draw it out here. So this is the demand minus the consumption tax. Okay. So I want you to notice here that these two don't have to touch the world price after a tariff or anything like that. These are the only thing that matters here is if you're going to replicate this. The only thing that matters is that you draw the new supply curve through this point and the new demand curve through this point. That is, you have to make sure you matches up the increase in production and the decrease in consumption with what happened with the import tariff. All right, having said that, I'm going to write some letters. A, B, C, D, E, and F. And then I'm going to try to show that the two domestic policies perfectly replicate the welfare effect as well as the market effect of the import tariffs. So here's so consumer surplus, producer surplus, government revenue, and total surplus. With a tariff, we know that the change in consumer surplus is a loss. A large loss is going to be minus A, B, C, D, E, and F. The gain in the producer surplus would be plus A. The gain in government revenue would be, in this diagram here, C, D, E. So you notice the rectangle there. And therefore, the entire country see a loss equal to minus B minus F. And again, B is the production distortion cost, F is the consumption distortion cost, and together they make up the deadweight loss of the import tariff. All right, a production subsidy. Let's do a production subsidy here. A production subsidy, as I said before, there is no impact on consumers because consumers pay the same price and they consume the same quantity. There will be an increase in producer surplus equal to A. You remember the government will lose A and B, and therefore the impact on the country from a production subsidy would be minus B. We just did that on the previous one. A consumption tax. I haven't done this one, but I will just talk through the welfare effect. The consumption tax, just like the production subsidy didn't have an impact on consumers, a consumption tax in an open market for an importing country would not have an impact on producers. So there would be no impact on producer surplus. And the reasoning would be very similar to what I talked about in terms of the production subsidy. However, a consumption tax will, of course, raise the price paid by consumers, and consumers will reduce their consumption. And since the price is exactly the same as with a tariff, and the loss in consumption is exactly the same, consumers would in fact lose A, B, C, D, E, and F as well. In terms of the cost of a consumption tax, well, that's actually a revenue. That is, it's not a cost. The government will collect money, and they will collect A, B, C, D, and E, that rectangle. That is the tax multiplied by the number of units consumed, a big rectangle like that. And if I just look at these ones, you can see that the change in total surplus would be minus F. And now, of course, you see what should be obvious, which is that if you combine the production subsidy and the consumption tax, the impact is exactly the same as the impact from the import tariff. So again, just to conclude, any trade policy can be replicated by the use of two domestic policies. In particular, an import tariff can be replicated by using a production subsidy and a consumption tax. Thank you very much.